Hey, it's Marty here from Nutrition again. Thanks for coming back for part 2. Today we're going to be covering the macronutrients, so the second part of our pillar. So we've got protein, fat, and carbohydrates. They are your 3 macronutrients there. So we'll start off with protein. So most people talk about proteins, the most important in their diet, sort of thing like that. Main reason for that is protein is broken down into, or made up of, amino acids, which are the building blocks of your muscle tissue. So therefore, when you're dieting, it's important to have a high protein intake to maintain that muscle tissue. And when trying to gain muscle, it's also important to up your protein intake. The other thing about muscle tissue is it's also active tissue. So the more muscle you have on your body, the higher, if you remember from part 1, the energy outside of the equation is going to be, because it's an active active type of tissue. It requires energy to survive and be used throughout the day, sort of thing. Protein is also the most thermogenic one out of the 3. So what that means is there's an amount of energy required to break down protein, fats, and carbohydrates. And of the 3, protein requires more than the others to be broken down and digested and absorbed into your body and used. I'll leave it there and not go too further into that. Recovery, obviously, because it's the building block of muscle tissue. When you're exercising, you break down muscle tissue. You do damage to it in order to build it back up. So it's important to make sure you have adequate protein to recover from the form of exercise you're doing in the day. The other thing to remember with it is basically it has 4 calories per gram. And while I'll touch on that is we're about to go into fat. So each of these per gram has an energy yield. So protein has 4, carbohydrates also have 4, and fat has 9. So that brings us to the calorie dense portion of this. Fats per gram provide more energy. So that's why it's much easier to overeat and consume too many calories when eating fats. Although they do have a higher satiety effect, which means basically they do make you feel fuller, it's far easier to consume a large amount of calories from fats. One example is nuts. They're very healthy for you, but it's very easy to get a large amount of calories in a very small portion because the nuts are very high in fat. The other thing about fats is you can't avoid them. These who say like zero fat diet, low fat diet, hormones are the building blocks of, fats are the building blocks of your hormones. So they are absolutely necessary part of your diet, especially the healthier versions of fats, which I'll go into detail in another video completely on fats. But basically, fats are needed and you can't avoid them and you can't leave them out of your diet because they are vital for your hormones, which, as you know, hormones, chemical messages drive your entire bodily function, sort of thing. Without them, would be lost. So the last one we're going to get to is carbohydrates. So the main things I want to touch on about this is carbohydrates is the only one of these that are non-essential. That meaning fats are needed for hormones, proteins are needed for muscle tissue, carbohydrates are needed for energy. You need at least a baseline of 50 grams a day because your brain can only function off carbohydrates. It can't function off fats. All the other tissues in your body can work around it and use fat tissue, but your brain needs carbohydrates. That's why they're important. Other things with it is basically it's activity dependent. The more activity you do, the more carbohydrates you're going to need. So if you're very active or an athlete or something like that, you're going to have a high carbohydrate need because you're burning through energy throughout the day. And the reason that is because the most readily available and fastest use fuel in our body is glucose, a form of sugar, which is a carbohydrate. That's what we use when we're exercising. That's what we're using a high intensity burst, when you're lifting weights, all those kind of things. So that's what makes it important. But we're able to store carbohydrates as glycogen in our body. So just a quick rough guide on that. Somebody my size, a male, can probably store about 800 grams of glycogen in their body for use as energy, which means you don't have to have carbohydrates every single day if you're not burning through them all. Our body does have the ability to store them. So it's not like, oh, I have a gym workout today, I have to eat a bunch of carbohydrates right before. If your diet's good and adequate in energy, you're already going to have enough carbohydrates there for that. But so the reason this is the second stage of our building block is obviously because you can't just, if you just follow the calories in, calories out portion of our building block and you consume all fat, you're going to be horribly missing out on protein, so you probably end up losing muscle mass. Yes, you're going to lose weight, but the big difference there is, are you having weight loss or are you having fat loss? And obviously our goal is fat loss. We want to maintain muscle tissue and lose fat.